Greetings, bibliophiles, and welcome back to The Book Thing. I've got a bit of a classic for you today. This is going to be a novel which has not only won a Hugo, but a Nebula as well, and there's not that many that can make that particular claim. The book in question is The Gods Themselves by Isaac Asimov, and it's one I've not read for quite a long time. It's one that's been on my shelf for a while, but it's been ages since I've actually read it. It is acclaimed as one of his best stories, and I think that's pretty fair. Just as a standalone novel, it doesn't really fit into his Empire/robots sequence, which a lot of his books and short stories can be slotted into. And while it doesn't have the kind of the breadth of vision that the Empire novels and the Foundation stories in particular have, those are still favourites of mine for a reason. The Gods Themselves is, as just a single piece of fiction, I think it's probably the most imaginative thing he wrote. It's more... It doesn't have the depth across time, but it has a breadth of imagination about it that maybe you don't quite find in other works of Asimov. Although that's not entirely fair, In terms of imagination, Asimov is, the robot series and all the Spacer books and the Empire and the Foundation. It's all there, but this goes in a direction that those don't. It's quite different from a lot of his other work in some ways. So, why is it so good? Well, Asimov, one of the criticisms that's made of Asimov is that his writing is not, it's not Shakespeare by any means. The appeal of Asimov lies in the ideas, and I think that's partly true for this. I mean, he's reasonably good at characterization, but it's not exactly the most sparkling prose even so. But it's the ideas in this book that make it good. And more specifically, it's the way it's set out. Now, it's actually split into three parts, which are titled Against Stupidity, The Gods Themselves, and Contend in Vain. So it's like, a quote that's split up into three bits. And the bookends, the first and third section, are set in a very recognisable, semi-near future Earth where inadvertently a source even of cheap energy has been discovered. And it turns out there's a catch, but various people, for various reasons, don't want to acknowledge the fact that there might be a catch because, this is very, very cheap, free. I know what I mean. It's very, very cheap energy. It's limitless energy. So they don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth. And it's part of the exploration of this book is, it's ponderings on human nature and how sometimes, we want things to be true, even at the expense of not looking too deeply into the ways that they might be. There might be downsides to them. And it's interesting because it does so in the context of a lot of the characters in the first and third sections are scientists, but they're still human. They still have human frailties, and it's sort of explores the ideas a bit of that even within the rigors of the scientific process, human flaws and frailties can still come into play, which is it's not something that you often see. Scientists are quite often depicted as being not quite human characters in some ways, always impartial and always infallible and whatever, at least in the terms of thinking about things logically. And this book is absolutely, it does not do that. These are very in some cases self-deluding people. There's one particular character where he makes an accidental discovery, which is a thing that happens in science sometimes, and it just completely goes to his head, and so he ends up being completely insufferable. It's not really in this first and third section where the book shines, though. It's the middle section where his imagination really runs riot. And we get this idea of not just an alien world, but an alien universe where the very physical laws of that universe are different than our own. And it's really well done, because he basically imagines a what if of I can't remember which nuclear force. It's either the strong or the weak nuclear force, but in which it is at a different level than it is in our own universe. And the whole thing with the cheap energy is that matter is being sent from one to the other, and because of this difference in the physical laws, this is the part where you have to suspend your disbelief that matter can be sent back and forth between different universes, but that it essentially means free energy for both universes. And the book makes clear from the start, it's not really a spoiler to say that there's a catch to this. The book makes clear from the start that there is a catch, and it's the part that's set on Earth is really people kind of like figuring out that there's this catch, and then figuring out what they can do about it, and the ways in which human nature sometimes make finding ways around things rather than trying to give up something that they've already decided is desirable and easy. It's kind of hard to, like, without being ultra specific about what goes on in the book. It's I don't know. This is maybe one where I have to avoid spoilers less, but I'm trying to avoid spoilers with these videos generally, because people might not have read this. I don't want to give things away. But yes, it is. I mean, the whole thing ties together really nicely, but it is that middle section. It's the I mean, it does commit that classic sci-fi sin of, oh yes, these are aliens, but they basically think like us, more or less. But it's still, I think it still does it well enough that it's a really enjoyable read, and especially going through that middle section where it's almost like a detective story, because you don't know much about these aliens. It kind of dumps you in at the deep end, and it just unfolds everything so nicely, and it lays out little clues, and as you go along you start to figure out what's going on and how this society works, and how the biology of these aliens work within the context of these altered physical laws compared to our own universe. And it's just it does it so well, and it does it so nicely, and it's just so unlike a lot of anything else that Asimov wrote, that this is why it stands out, because I mean, it in order for it to be relatable, in a way they have to be like us in some ways, and they are like us in a lot of ways, but it makes them different enough as well that it's an enjoyable exercise in imagination, basically. So I'm kind of not surprised that this is one that has had a lot of accolades, and that even if I didn't know already that it was one that is regarded as one of his best, even if I'd come to it blind, I probably still would have that opinion, because it's just it's a really fantastic bit of classic sci-fi, and it's just it's one that even if you've never read any other Asimov, you probably should sit down and read, because it's not like other Asimov. It's just really enjoyable. So, I mean, the plot, very briefly, is about this. It's not even about the discovery of the energy source. I mean, it relays that information, but it's more about this discovering what the problem is with it, and then we get the middle section on the in the alien universe, and then in the last bit with the third section, it's more kind of trying to figure out solutions rather than trying to stop the whole thing and switch off the free energy, which is something that humanity is very unwilling to do for obvious reasons. So the plot it's not a tremendously complicated plot in a lot of ways, but it's quite a clever one, just because it does it explores human psychology as much as it tries to, posit what an alien society might be like with these physical laws that are different to our own. So the whole thing is enjoyable, but it really is that middle section that shines. So I've picked out a bit to read from the first section, fairly early in the book, and it was quite difficult choosing what to read, because choosing something from the middle section without context, it would be quite difficult, because it builds up and it builds up, and you just have to read the thing from start to finish, basically. But the bit I'm going to read, it sets out some of the backstory, as it were. Peter Lamont had been 2 years old when Hallam had picked up his altered tungsten for the first time. When he was 25, he joined Pump Station 1 with the print on his own doctoral dissertation still fresh, and accepted a simultaneous appointment on the physics faculty of the university. It was a remarkably satisfactory achievement for the young man. Pump Station 1 was lacking in the glisten of the later stations, but it was the granddaddy of them all, of the entire chain that circled the planet now, even though the entire technology was only a couple of decades old. No major technological advance had ever caught hold so rapidly and so entirely, and why not? It meant free energy without limit and without problems. It was the Santa Claus and the Aladdin's lamp of the entire world. Lamont had taken the job in order to deal with problems of the highest theoretical abstraction, and yet he found himself interested in the amazing story of the development of the electron pump. It had never been written up in its entirety by someone who truly understood the theoretical principles, insofar as they could be understood, and who had some ability in translating the complexities for the general public. To be sure, Hallam himself had written a number of articles for the popular media, but these did not represent a connected, reasoned history, something Lamont yearned to supply. He used Hallam's articles to begin with, other reminiscences in published form, the official documents so to speak, carrying them through to Hallam's world-shaking remark, the Great Insight as it was often called, invariably with capital letters. Afterwards, of course, when Lamont had experienced his disillusionment, he began digging deeper, and the question arose in his mind as to whether Hallam's great remark had really been Hallam's. It had been advanced at the seminar which marked the true beginning of the electron pump, and yet, as it turned out, it was extraordinarily difficult to get the details of that seminar and quite impossible to get the voice recordings. Eventually, Lamont began to suspect that the dimness of the footprints left on the sands of time by that seminar was not entirely accidental. Putting several items ingeniously together, it began to seem that there was a reasonable chance that John F.X. McFarland had said something very nearly like the crucial statement Hallam had made, and had done so before Hallam. He went to see McFarland, who was featured not at all in the official accounts, and who was now doing upper atmosphere research with particular reference to the solar wind. It was not a top echelon job, but it had its perquisites, and it had more than a little to do with pump effects. McFarland had clearly avoided suffering the fate of oblivion that had overtaken Denison. He was polite enough to Lamont and willing to talk on any subject except the events of that seminar. That he simply didn't remember. Lamont insisted, quoting the evidence he had gathered. McFarland took out a pipe, filled it, inspected his contents thoroughly, and said, with a queer intentness, "I don't choose to remember, because it doesn't matter. It really doesn't. Suppose I laid a claim to having said something. No one would believe it. I would look like an idiot and a megalomaniac one. And Hallam would see to it that you were retired? I'm not saying that, but I don't see that it would do me any good. What's the difference, anyway?" "A matter of historical truth," said Lamont. "Oh, bull. The historical truth is that Hallam never let go. He drove everyone into investigating, whether they wanted to or not. Without him, that tungsten would have eventually exploded with I don't know how many casualties. There might never have been another sample, and we might never have had the pump. Hallam deserves the credit for it, even if he doesn't deserve the credit. And if that doesn't make sense, I can't help it, because history doesn't make sense." Lamont wasn't satisfied with that, but he had to make it do, for McFarland would simply say no more. So yeah, there you go. There's probably a couple of things in that passage that don't make much sense without further context, but you get some idea of the quality of the writing, and it is still the usual Asimov stuff. He sketches in the character more than makes deeply complicated portraits, but it's enough. It's enough, and the story is interesting enough. And especially that middle section, the way he unfolds everything is interesting enough to keep it really rolling along. And it's overall, it's just a really enjoyable book, and it's considered a classic of sci-fi for a very good reason. So I definitely recommend this one. If you've never read it, you definitely should, even if the idea of Asimov in your mind is associated with kind of fuddy-duddy science fiction of the 50s and 60s. It's worth it. It absolutely is worth it. And it's one that you can probably pick up fairly easily as well. You know, I think I got my my paperback with Chris Voss cover. It's one of those ones, probably quite cheaply second hand. So yeah, it's there's not really a lot of excuse for not reading this one. It is a real classic. So hopefully you have enjoyed this video, and if you have, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.